And good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to start off by complimenting the Border Trade and Immigration Migration Institute, the College of Technology, headed up by Dean Ambler, Kurt Behrens, Kevin Clement, and the terrific staff at the BTI. It took us a lot of courage, and I was pleased to receive the email last week that said the conference is going on. And I'm aware, as you are, that was not an easy decision. Having been involved in DHS at the time of the H1N1 and the Ebola and SARS, I know that we are now in the midst of the greatest uncertainty. When you're in the middle of it, you don't know whether you're dealing with a H1N1 or with the Spanish flu that actually affected tens of millions of people after World War I. So it took a certain amount of practicing what you preach, walking the talk, and engaging in the kind of risk management that was embodied in the email. However it comes out, however history records this decision, the idea is to actually put it in perspective and to engage in the kind of risk management, particularly at this juncture. So kudos to the BTI. And then we actually saw another dimension of the future, which was the remarkable Jim Loy coming to us by Zoom in from a remote setting. And for all of the schools, and I certainly understand this, having been involved in education, for all of the schools that are now actually stopping the semester and moving to virtual classes and take-home examinations, I actually point out to you that this is going to be a good exercise for the country because, in fact, if you project out a generation from now, human contact, while it remains critical as we network here today, actually we need to build a lot more virtual interaction into our daily routines. And the magnificent presentation, both substantively and informed by Jim Loy, I think demonstrated that dimension. So either way, Tony and Kurt, Kevin, and the BTI team, I think there were lessons on both ends of this experience. So what I'd like to do today is actually build on what Admiral Loy indicated. You'll see that I could not help but take advantage of Jim, always a teacher to all of us, to ask him the question about the interaction of national policy and international policy, and he provided a terrific start to the presentation. And I promise, in the time I have, I will get from the 17th century to the 21st century without undue delay. But I did want to ask you to reflect on where in fact we got the idea that nation states are the governing units in the international affairs, that it's actually nation states rather than any other unit that governs the handling of affairs inside the country and the movement outside. And I want you to think about that for a moment as I actually raise to you this idea of the port of the future, because as the Spanish philosopher said, those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So I want you to reflect on this as I actually look at the nature of this conference, the port of the future. And the title that I gave the talk was actually, let's see, a future that is not what it used to be. That line actually comes from Paul Valéry, a French poet, who said, "The challenge of our times is that the future is not what it used to be." And in fact, it is not what it used to be. It's changed in a remarkable set of ways. So think about the basic idea of a port. What is a port of entry? Port of entry is the place on a national territorial border where you enter from one sovereignty into another sovereignty. It is by definition a bottleneck. It's intended to be a bottleneck that slows down the traffic so that one sovereignty can look at a person or a cargo shipment coming from one sovereign nation to another. Obviously, the port of the future has got to take that into account, but the point can't be to have a bottleneck at the border line. Instead, what we have to do is enlist time and space to open up that process, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. So I'm not as, the four ways in which we do that are actually joint border management, big data analytics. The third actually is risk management, and the fourth is advanced customized technology. I want to take that up with you as we look at how do we go from the port as a bottleneck to the port as a vehicle of globalization. So let's, as I said, I'm not as good as the Admiral, so I can't give you one letter, but I thought that was a terrific heuristic device, and I adopted it. So think about CBM. I'll give you three initials. CBM, the Collaborative Border Management, Push the Borders Out, PBO, Border Externalization, and DATS, Data Analysis, and Traffic Segmentation, and ACT, Advanced Customized Technology. So I'll come back to that, but think about as we start from the Treaty of Westphalia and the role of nation states, about those four ways of building the port of the future, where we need to be going. So the Treaty of Westphalia actually put an end to the 30 Years' War in Europe in the 17th century. Prior to that time, the truth be told, we didn't think in terms of nation states. We didn't think of ourselves as French men and women or Japanese men and women, let alone as Nigerian men and women. We saw ourselves, for the most part, as involved in empires. So in the 17th century, before the Treaty of Westphalia, you really were dealing with the Ottoman Empire here. You were dealing with the Russian Empire. You're dealing with the Holy Roman Empire in Europe, and then you were dealing with the Persian Empire further east. People thought of themselves as being part of the empires, not as being part of nationalities. It was really the Treaty of Westphalia we started to recognize this idea of borders, territorial borders, as lines on a map that separated one nation from another nation. In the beginning, there were a handful of them in the 17th century. Fast forward today, and we have 190 separate sets of nation states, each of which claims sovereign power within borders defined by lines on a map and on the ground that create its nation state. And that's the basic way in which we govern the world, and the world is governed today. Geopolitics is about comparative advantage, how one nation competes with another and gains advantage. I want you to think about that in the context of the traffic that we manage at the ports of entry. We have in the United States 327 ports of entry, airports, seaports, and land ports. That has been the bottleneck through which we move the trillions of dollars in trade and the millions of people that move back and forth in and out of our country as others. But I want you to think of a future in which we not only have 327 ports of entry, maritime, air, and land, but if you get into the cyber domain, think about how the future is not what it used to be. In one real important sense, we actually have 330 million separate ports of entry through which Americans are connected to the outside. And in a world in which much of the traffic is not just physical people and physical cargo, but rather cyber messages and data flows and the flow of electron, every computer, every smartphone, every device and tablet is a port of entry. You could, obviously we can reach anyone in the UK or anyone in Shanghai, China, right from this room. So think about paradigm shifts, the kinds of things that Admiral Loy was talking about. And what I want to explore with you is the foundation for that, how that has affected the way we see ports of entry, and then actually end up with some suggestions about how those acronyms will help us approach this. So remember, 190 separate jurisdictions, separating sovereignties, lines on a map, lines in the sand, and yet you have the reality today that most of the movement around the globe are flows. And the point is that this is a depiction of maritime flows between East Asia and the west coast of North America, transatlantic between the United States and Europe. And this is the flow of cargo, the flow of passengers in terms of passenger cruise liners and the like. This is another depiction in a different way that shows the ports of entry from which these goods start and the flows by which they end up in the consuming countries. You'll notice that today most traffic is from East Asia until through North America or transatlantic. Flows will dominate the history of the world going forward, and what we'll begin to see is a lot more traffic between Africa and South Asia, and we'll be able to track where history is going by looking at the trends of where are these flows. And the flows are not only people, the same is true with regard to air traffic. Think about the implications of a world in which you can be anywhere on the globe, even on a commercial airline, to anywhere else on the globe within 24 hours. The movement of people, we have more people on the move every day in the United States. More than 1 million people are coming in and out of our airports, seaports, and many other hundreds of thousands moving across the land port. And it's not only physical movement, it's also data, electrons, this is a visualization of flows of the movement of data across the world. Just to keep moving, it's not only the lawful trade and travel, but the flows within the interstices of lawful trade and travel is the illicit trade and travel of narcotics, contraband, irregular migration, terrorism, and similar unlawful movements of goods, people. But what is the point? And as you look from now on, I hope you'll take as a takeaway, when you look at mapping where the global civilization is, you'll look at flows. Think about the world in terms of the flows from ports of entry, across land routes, sea routes, air routes, and don't forget cyber, the cyber domain, the routes that are in cyberspace, which oftentimes we cannot tell what those routes are. Without the greatest investigation, we cannot often tell when there is a hacking from which country the hacking or the intrusion came, adding to the fact that the future is not what it used to be. So think about the flows, and the idea of globalization is actually this 24/7, 365 movement of goods, people, ideas, cargo, labor, electrons that is nonstop moving across toward borderlines. And what you see is this historic collision between the Westphalian nation state, the lines on a map or in the sand, in which the sovereign power to control what comes in and what goes out actually has to deal with basically borderless flows. Flows that, while they move across borders, are moving between borders and constitute the challenge. So we have this clash, hopefully not a collision, although it often does, between the traditional Westphalian borderlines territorially defined and globalization, the movement of globalization, which is nonstop, instantaneous often movement of everything from goods to images, ideas, and data. And we have to think about borders no longer, and ports of the future, no longer as just the first line of defense, the first place where you confront people entering the country, but it's really the last. And we sort of, we learned that dramatically in the Christmas Day 2009 with Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib, the underwear bomber. You remember that the underwear bomber, Abdul-Muttalib, bought a ticket in Nigeria, boarded a plane in Ghana, flew to Schiphol Airport in the Netherlands, and then boarded a Northwest airliner flight to Detroit with the intention of blowing the plane up over Windsor and Detroit. He had been trained by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and he would have succeeded save for the fact that when he tried to light the PETN explosives in his underwear, it didn't ignite, went into the bathroom, came out with his underwear smoking, and he was tackled by passengers that kept him from actually blowing up the airplane. I remember that day not only because it was Christmas and I had been designated to become the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection. We spent the whole day reacting to this event, but we gave Janet Napolitano, then the Secretary, some bum advice. Some of you may remember that she got on national television and she said, the system worked. She was the designated spokesperson sent out there, and she said the system worked. And what she meant, and she was laughed off the stage, that the system, how did the system work? Well, in retrospect, she was right, but it was the wrong system. CBP had actually identified Abdul-Muttalib as a person of interest, and he had been identified after he left Schiphol in the Netherlands, flying toward Wayne County Airport in Michigan and in Detroit. He'd been identified as a person of interest, and the plan was to take him off the airplane after he landed in Detroit. But of course, and that was the system we had in those days. Of course, we realized that he would have completed the terrorist act, and therefore TSA, CBP, and the U.S. government completely revamped the passenger system, recognizing that the port of entry, the 327 ports of entry, are not the first line of defense. They're the last line of defense, and that you actually have to enlist time and space, which is a phenomenon that will characterize the port of the future in ways we can discuss. The only thing worse than having the wrong system and getting your secretary out and making a fool of herself is that the same thing happened 10 months later with regard to cargo, and we didn't realize it. The Yemen cargo plot. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula again put PE-10 explosives in printer cartridges, disguised it as printer powder. It went through the scanning of FedEx and UPS and DHL, and you couldn't tell the difference. And the idea was to have the planes explode over Chicago. Now, these were two packages addressed to synagogues in Chicago. And I can tell you then I was the commissioner of CBP. We would have looked at packages coming from Sana'a, Yemen, in the Arabian Peninsula, addressed to synagogues in Chicago. But again, the intention was to, and the procedure was to do that at the mail depot at O'Hare Airport. It was at that point that we realized that the realization that the system was wrong, that we had discovered with regard to Abdul Muttalib, was not just a one-off. And it completely changed, but rather applied to cargo as well. And what that did was completely revamp CBP's approach to the way we see the protection of borders. It's not at the borderline, it's away from the borderline, and you enlist time and space as your allies. The job is not to inspect at the borderline, but to identify high risk before it gets to the borderline and to take action accordingly. These were the kind of insights that affected border management a decade ago, and that really defined the reality of what we have to do going forward. So if you look at the implications of these new systems that came on, you'll see that they all take into account this idea that Homeland Security internal defense is inherently transnational. There is nothing that affects our homeland or our borders that do not have a cause or effect that originate outside the territorial borderlines. That's a paradigm change of massive proportions in the way in which we organize for the future. What we'll be looking at now briefly is how the new paradigm of border management actually can be converted over the next generation into the port of the future, which is what we're looking at here today. Every one of these matters, though, while it looks like one of the dangers in planning for the future is you want to be careful about projecting out what's going on today in a linear fashion into the future. That leads to more forecasting errors because, in fact, the essence of wisdom is that tomorrow's problems may not be the same as today's. So you want to be careful about taking a straight line projection. Every one of the strategies we developed to deal with Abdul Muttalib and the Yemen cargo plot and characterize border security and management today, we build on those for the port of the future. But I submit to you that the kind of power and the changes in technology, skill and knowledge make these not just linear projections, but will actually change the way in which we work. So that as we get to data management, keep in mind that as powerful as our computers are today, they are a fraction of what quantum computing will bring with its superpositioning of qubits and the entanglement of qubits, so-called, to actually multiply the ability to analyze data beyond what, frankly, we can believe and encompass in our strategies today. But the first lesson, CBM, collaborative border management. What are the lessons of the idea of a transnational homeland security? It's that you really cannot defend your border from one side alone. And as that was the point of my question to Admiral Loy, and I wouldn't miss the opportunity to seeking his wisdom. And as he suggested, you cannot manage something domestically alone without having cooperation across the territorial borderline. That's the lesson. And with regard to land management, as we've done with the Canadians in pre-clearance and airports, as we've done with Shiprider and the United States Coast Guard and the RCMPs and the Canadian Mounted Police on the Great Lakes, we cannot manage this alone. And the lag between the agreements among nations, even as friendly as we are with Canada, and as increasingly friendly as we are with Mexico, we're still way behind the curve in building a collaborative border management. And these are the kinds of matters that we really have to start addressing. This is a graphic depiction of the same thing in terms of greater sharing of information on the left axis, greater jointness of operational coordination on the right axis and the bottom axis. And you see the different combinations that can be the modulation from full cooperation, from no cooperation, some of the interim steps that the port of the future will have to incorporate as we go, as we move along. And I recognize if this presentation be available to all of you to actually look at. I've never been a great one reading slides or stopping at them. So, but you get the gist. This is between the ports of entry, how you would have cooperation, and then port of entry operations themselves, the continuum from no cooperation to where the future must be as we organize our ports, where we cannot manage them effectively or efficiently without engaging with that Westphalian nation state that is either contiguous to us or, in the case, for example, of the Five Eyes, is politically close to us. We need to move forward, and I want to address and will shortly the obstacles that we've had to joint border management, which we can work on. But the closest we come in Sweetgrass is we have a port of entry on the land that's actually, the Canadian side is built right up against the U.S. side, and while there's not a lot of joint management, the possibility exists for that, and the planning of the port of entry took that into account. It's a model for how we should be organizing, as opposed to planning ports of entry. We need to be doing that together as a matter of infrastructure, so that we avoid. This is the Garrett Reinhardt in his presentation was referring to Tecate, a small port of entry on the Baja California border. This is the way it is organized, not terribly aligned. Here's the U.S. port, and you come in and out, and there's no coordination in infrastructure between the Mexican side and the U.S. side. And all of that was the way in which we operated in the past, but the port of the future will have to operate differently. So joint border management, CBM, collaborative border management. The problem that we have in global flows that are regulated by Westphalian nation states is that 97 to 98% of the trade, the global flows, all of them, ideas, images, cargo goods, financial flows, they're actually perfectly lawful and legitimate. And in the past, we have focused on finding the 2% high risk. And one of the suggestions I want to make about the port of the future is we have to stop focusing on the needle in the haystack, although that's still the problem, plucking out the high risk and the dangerous goods and people from the lawful flows. But in the world we live in, the movement of the lawful flows is absolutely essential to dealing with the problem. When we look for a needle in a haystack, it's an awesome task, and you think about, well, how do you find a needle in the haystack? And there are three ways. Actually, there's a fourth way. You could burn down the haystack, but that would be self-defeating. We don't want to typically do that. But the other three ways of doing it is that you look at every piece of straw, that you actually move, and you do what we did after 9/11 when we shut down the ports of entry. We treated them as our first line of defense. We shut down the ports of entry. The line stretched back 20 miles north into Canada, 20 miles south into Mexico. We looked at every car, opened every trunk, and that obviously didn't work. Within a week, the president of General Motors called President Bush and said, if we continue to react to Al-Qaeda this way, we will need to shut down GM plants because we're so totally disrupting the internal supply chain platform and supply chain of General Motors. And it was really that, again, a little bit like what would come with Abdul Muttalib and the Yemen cargo plot, is we rethought it, and U.S. Customs under then Commissioner Bonner started developing techniques to deal with not looking at every piece of straw. Now, using intelligence to locate the needle, knowing how you can find you get very specific granulated intelligence, you know where the needle is, you reach into the haystack and you pluck it out. Intelligence sharing has gotten much better since 9/11, but it's still not the way in which we can rely routinely on doing it. In fact, in the Yemen cargo plot, the only way we understood this was that Saudi Arabian intelligence had gotten to the CIA and told us that 2 of those packages coming from Yemen, and gave the manifest numbers, were actually going to blow up. So the way to deal with finding the needle in a haystack is to make the haystack smaller. And what we've done that through trusted trader programs, and we've gotten stronger in both ends of the equation. Finding the needle in the haystack through better intelligence and targeting, but also moving away the hay so that we can actually focus our resources on the high risk persons and goods. Now, consider this: when we started this process 2 decades ago, we thought that security and trade facilitation were mutually exclusive vehicles or variables, and that we needed, in order to get better security, you needed to slow down the traffic, to look at and do the inspection at the borderline. And conversely, if you wanted to speed up the traffic, you would, by definition, have to lower your security level. What we discovered in the last 10 years is that one of the few places we can have our cake and eat it too, actually moving low-risk traffic through the bottleneck, through the port of entry, is actually not just good for trade facilitation, it's actually a security regime. And the reason it's a security regime is that at any level of resource allocation, if you move traffic through the port of entry, you can actually focus your attention on high-risk persons and cargo, or persons and cargo about which you don't have a sufficient amount of data or information to make a judgment about the degree of risk they present. How many of you are members of PreCheck, TSA's PreCheck? All right. How many of you are members of CBP, the Global Entry Program? Well, so you all get it. That's the theory of border management that has now been implemented across the board. Move and expedite lawful trade and travel so that you can focus your resources on the remaining travel. That's the theory of border management. Okay, here are just others you'll want to look at for when you have a chance, the way in which we now manage this traffic. The same thing with regard to the vetting, having trusted trader, trusted traveler programs, and targeting programs. That's the essence of today. What is different is actually the data analytics that are now available and the machine learning that's can be accomplished. This is the game changer. If you ask me what is the game changer for the port of the future, it's not only are we going to push inspections away from the ports, get away from the bottleneck, but we're going to do it based on data analytics that permit us to do the kind of assessment of risk that was simply not possible under conventional computing methods. And when we start moving toward quantum computing, it'll be an entirely different game. But here, for the operators in the room, is the major implication of the new methods that we have. So the problem of managing here is that agencies did not like to share information. They do not like to share information by reason of law, privacy concerns, proprietary concerns, turf protection. Agencies have not been good at doing this. The new methods of computing and data analysis called the hub and spoke or containerized analysis actually permit every company and every agency to put their data in a self-protected cloud that can be stovepiped. And what the software can do now, you're all familiar with federated searches, but there's a new technique called federated learning in which software can go into each of those stovepiped clouds, derive signal and data, come out with having gotten the benefits of shared data, but the data never leaves the cloud. This is the breakthrough that's coming in terms of agency cooperation, public-private cooperation, and it's well within reach. This will change the paradigm. Information is power. In the past, what we took away from that when we were taught that by our mothers or our teachers was that, in fact, you hold the information, you don't share it until somebody gives you something. Information's power. If you want my information, give me something for it. In the digital world we live in, with the amount of data, in fact, the data that's in 90% of the data now stored in the cloud, public and private sector alone, was generated in the last 2 years. So in the world in which data is being generated at that rate, the issue is not to hoard, but to share so that you can make usable, actionable information out of data. If you don't share your data, you will be left behind after being isolated. I'm going to short shrift technology, customized advanced technology. Garrett Reinhardt was going through the large-scale NII devices that CBP is deploying across the border. That's just the beginning of it on X-ray. That takes X-ray scanning to the next level, but we have scanning that can be done, as Ben Rawbaum, the Lanton Project, is working on out of BTI, can be done with drones using other than X-ray scans to measure signatures, chemical signatures, and a whole variety of other signatures. Taking text in the big data analytics that I discussed, combining it with image data, we will get visibility on these flows coming toward us, and we can do it far away from the border. And then, of course, you've got drone technology, but there are 100 new technologies. Steve Roop and the freight shuttle system that Texas A&M has worked on, that's coming to help in the port of the future. I had let me just mention a couple of others, and then Kevin, I'll wrap up. The kinds of technologies that are now available is, imagine instead of having wait times, having everything backed up at the border, what if everybody got an appointment to actually cross the border at a particular time? And we actually started to auction wait times at the port of the future based on crossing. If you wanted to cross at a very low cost, you might have to take your crossing at 3 o'clock in the morning, but if you wanted to cross at peak time when everyone wants to cross, you'd pay an auction price. That will generate the resources that CBP and other federal agencies need to maintain ports on a 7, 24, 365 day a year basis. You can't keep a port open for 18 hours, let alone 12 hours in the port of the future. So that's, ladies and gentlemen, that's a glimpse into the future that I'd like to suggest, along with such things as drone highways that South Korea is working on. The idea that facial recognition, right now, if you in the systems we use to screen people at TSA and elsewhere, it's all based on names and data, and you can't. There are too many Jesus Guzman to know that is one of the sons of Chapo Guzman. Facial recognition will be part of the port of the future. So, in summary, here they are. CBM, PBO, RM, DATS, and ACT. And it's altogether fitting and proper that ACT is the last one of advanced customized technology, because in fact you're the men and women who will create this port of the future over the next generation, and I look forward to seeing it from somewhere else, far away from the border. Thank you very much, and have a great conference.